Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankaramadhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Om. Okay, in this video, I'm going to be answering a question that someone sent to me. This question is about a text called Atma Nirvritti that was written by a spiritual teacher named Sri Atmananda. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Sri Atmananda or any of his writings, it bears mentioning that Atma Nirvritti is not, strictly speaking, considered to be a traditional Vedanta text. I actually haven't fully read Atma Nirvritti, but I have studied another text written by Sri Atmananda called Atma Darshan. Okay? So, based on reading Atma Darshan, this is the conclusion that I came to. That even though, as I said, strictly speaking, the works of Sri Atmananda are not technically considered to be traditional Vedanta texts, and even him as a teacher, he may not be considered to be a traditional Vedanta teacher. Okay, keeping that in mind, when you do read his works, like Atma Darshan, you can see that in essence, he is saying the exact same thing as Vedanta. Now, even maybe he himself considered, maybe he considered himself to be a Vedanta teacher, and I think many people do consider him to be a Vedanta teacher. I'm just saying that from a traditional viewpoint, he may not be considered a traditional Vedanta teacher, or his works may not be considered to be traditional Vedanta works. So, in essence, what I've seen in his writings, he is saying the same thing as traditional Vedanta. But the difference that I've noticed is one of style. Sometimes the language might be a little bit different, the metaphors might be a little bit different, or just the way that the information is presented might be just a little bit different. And for some people, especially if you're coming from the traditional Vedanta background, for some people this can be potentially confusing, just the way that the language is used. And so for that reason, I don't necessarily recommend people to study Atma Darshan or Atma Nirvritti if they haven't already studied the traditional Vedanta text. And there's a bunch of them. So we've got Tattva Bodh, Atma Bodh, Aparokshanabhuti, Drik Vivekya, Upadesha Sahasri. You've got the Bhagavad Gita, all of the Upanishads. There's a big long list of traditional Vedanta scriptures. So I would recommend that you study those first and get familiar with them first. There's plenty of material to go over. However, it's not to say that you can't study Atma Darshan or Atma Nirvritti. They have a lot of good things to say in them, and the essence of what's being said is the same as Vedanta. But I would just say that because of the potential for confusion owing to different style or language, that if you're going to study these texts, that you have them unfolded to you by a teacher who is familiar with the traditional method of teaching Vedanta, okay, the traditional method of teaching Vedanta. And the only person that I know of that does that is my own teacher, James Swartz, also known as Ram. So if you are interested in the text like Atma Darshan or Atma Nirvritti, then go to his website, shiningworld.com, and take a look at some of his videos, because he unfolds these texts from the traditional Vedanta perspective in order to avoid any possible confusion. And actually, the person that wrote to me with this question is studying these texts in that way, I believe. I think he is familiar with my teacher. But like I said, it's good to have these texts taught from the perspective of traditional Vedanta to avoid confusion. And this question actually emphasizes or illustrates that point. Okay? So this person wrote to me and said, hey, I've been reading Atma Nirvritti, and this verse I have a question about. Here's the verse and the question. The verse is verse number 6 in chapter 22. The chapter is entitled Atma's Disappointment. And in this short chapter, Atma, the self, you, your true nature, is personified. And through this personification, the chapter is showing how the self is disappointed that nobody seems to notice that it's there. Again, this is just a literary device. The self isn't a person. The self isn't disappointed that you don't know that you're the self. All right, so this is just an interesting literary device. Like I said, it's chapter 2, verse 6. And it reads, my position is just in front of the eyes. It is in and through me that all men see, yet they don't see me. This is most surprising. So the pronoun my and me is referring to the self. So I'll read that again from that perspective. The position of the self is just in front of the eyes. It is in and through the self that all men see, yet they don't see the self. This is most surprising. So the question is, should this statement be taken literally? I mean, sometimes when my mind is very clear, I see things differently. Colors are more luminous. It seems that everything is flat, like a screen in front of my eyes. So I wonder, is this screen the self? But this still seems like indirect knowledge. So should I keep inquiring into who is seeing this? Who is seeing this flat screen? Who's having this experience? I can see things as non-dual for some moments, but the eye that's seeing is just the person, the jiva. I've wondered, what's happening here? Is there something obvious that I'm not noticing? When reading Atma Nirvritti, it seems that this verse has something to do with this perception that I've been having. But I know that perception is just a state of mind. So we'll take each part of this question and answer each part individually. So the first part of the question is, should I take this statement literally? And it's referring to the first part of the verse that my position is just in front of the eyes, meaning the self's position is just in front of the eyes. Now, the short answer here is no. You can't take this statement literally. If you take the statement literally, that the self is located in some particular spot, or for instance, if it's right in front of your eyes, then you can point to it and say, oh, that's the self. Okay, if you take it that way, then the statement is incorrect because it's making it sound like, again, the self is located in a particular spot, or more importantly, that the self is an object that's known to you. If the self is something that your eyes see, then it's an object. If the self is a way that your eyes are seeing, for instance, in the question, he says sometimes that he has an experience that he sees things differently. Colors look different. everything looks kind of flat or projected onto a screen. Okay, so what the eyes see, or even how the eyes see things, are both objects, okay, because they are experiences that are known to you. Yeah, so to say that the self is an object is incorrect. Right? The objects can be the self because this is a non-dual reality, but the self can never be the objects. The conscious subject can never be the known objects. So, taken literally, that statement is wrong. But is the statement meant to be taken literally in the first place? You know, judging from reading another work by Sri Atmananda, Atma Darshan, I would say no. It seems very obvious by what Atmananda writes that he is a self-realized person and that he knows what he's talking about. Even from the following line, okay, we can see that this first statement shouldn't be taken in a literal sense. So taken in context of the whole verse, let's see what it might really mean. Okay, so it says, my position is just in front of the eyes, right? So that makes it sound like the self is somewhere out here to be seen. But the next line says, it is in and through me that all men see. Okay, so this makes it a little bit different. To say it is in me that all men see, it is through me that all men see. So, how can you say that you see? Your eyes are seeing objects, and those images of the objects appear in your mind. So how do you know that your mind is there? Because you're conscious of the mind. The mind is an object that's known to you. So in that regard, you can say that seeing or perception or the images that appear in your mind, all of those things, whether they be sights, sounds, taste, touch, smell, etc. No matter what those things are, all of those things are only known by the presence of you, consciousness. So in that regard, the second sentence here is saying that it is in me that all men see. So what it's saying is that not that the self is an object in your sight, but he's saying that sight or perception in general is appearing in the self, in consciousness. And it's saying that through me all men see. It's saying that by merit of the fact that the self exists and that the nature of the self is consciousness, that sight is even possible. Because there can't be any perception, number one, if you are non-existent. A non-existent entity isn't capable of perception. And number two, there's not going to be any perception without consciousness. So perception can only happen because consciousness is there, because consciousness exists. And all of that perception happens, so you can say then that all of that perception happens within the scope or within consciousness. So knowing that this second verse is saying that, okay, knowing that the second verse is saying that perception appears in you, in consciousness, and only is possible because of you, we can infer that perhaps this first line, this is my guess, okay, I'm guessing that this first line has not been translated correctly. Now, a lot of the times when something's written in another language, this text was actually written originally in Malayalam, Okay, so when you translate something from one language into another, there's obviously room for error, especially when the person who is doing the translating may not understand the subject matter. And that's always very possible when you have a difficult subject matter, like discussing the nature of the self, non-duality, Vedanta, etc. However, in this case, the author himself, Sri Atmananda, wrote the original text in Malayalam and then translated it into English. So we have to rule out that possibility that someone who didn't understand what was being said mistranslated it based on a misunderstanding. However, I will say that my guess is simply that because English was a second language for Sri Atmananda, that perhaps he just chose the wrong words or chose words that potentially can be misleading, okay? Because the word position, for instance, is misleading. It makes it sound like you, the self, are in a particular place when all places actually are in you. Saying you're in front of the eyes. That also, again, makes it sound like what? That the self is out here in front of your eyes, when in fact the eyes and anything in front of the eyes are actually appearing in you, in the self. So what I would venture to say is that this phrase, my position is just in front of the eyes, is similar to the phrase, it's right in front of your eyes, or right in front of your face. Now that statement isn't necessarily to be taken literally. When you say, hey, the answer is right in front of your eyes, hey, the answer is right in front of your face, it doesn't mean that the answer is literally sitting there right in front of your face. The implied meaning of that statement is that it's obvious. All right, so the first line of this statement, okay, the first line of this verse here, my position is just in front of the eyes, is like saying the self is right in front of your face. The self is right in front of your eyes. Okay, so it doesn't mean in that case that it's like right there in front of your eyes. It just means that the self is completely obvious. Right? That's the meaning here. Obvious. The self is obvious. So the first part of the verse could read, I am totally obvious. It's in and through me that all men see, yet they don't see me. This is most surprising. It is surprising. Because if it is obvious, then it's strange that no one seems to notice the self. So why is it obvious, though? When we say if it's strange not to notice it, what do we mean that, it's obvious? Well, we said that the self is consciousness, existence. Okay, they're the exact same thing, consciousness and existence. If you're conscious, you exist. If you exist, you're conscious. They're the same thing. See? Is it difficult to know that you exist? Does it require some proof? Is it difficult to know that you're conscious? Does it require proof? No. It's completely obvious. It's completely self-evident. By merit of the very fact that you exist, that you are conscious, it proves that you exist and that you're conscious. There's not some particular test you have to run. There doesn't have to be any kind of logical analysis. There's nothing in particular that you have to see or taste or touch or smell to prove that you exist and that you are conscious. So that's why it's completely obvious. In that sense, it's self-evident. It doesn't require any particular thing to prove it. The common example that's used is your eyes. Okay? Now, it's not like you have to go and look in a mirror and see your eyes to know that you have eyes. Okay? No proof in that regard is necessary. No one is going to say, hey, can you hand me a mirror? I just want to make sure I've got eyes. Nobody does that. Why don't they do that? Because by merit of the very fact that you see proves that you have eyes. So we don't have to prove that you're the self. We're saying that the self is existence, consciousness, and it's completely obvious that you exist and that you are conscious. So we don't have to prove it in that sense. So if it's so obvious, then, why why do we have so much trouble seeing it? Well, seeing, okay, not meaning literally see it. We're just saying, why do we have trouble understanding this? Well, let me ask you this. What do you see right now in this video? You might say, well, I see Vishnudeva, I see I see a table back here and some pictures, I see a wall, I see a bookcase over there. Okay, fair enough. But I would say that's not everything. There's something you're missing. What would that be? What's something very obvious that you're missing? What's something that's completely self-evident that you're missing? Light. You forgot to say that you're seeing light. Now, light is always present, whenever you're seeing objects. And so it's easy to miss it. It's easy to look at the objects and forget that the light is there, because we just tend to take it for granted because it's always present in these situations where we're seeing things. And in the same way, our own existence and our own consciousness is overlooked because we tend to take it for granted because it's always there. Instead of noticing the fact that we exist and that we're conscious, our attention tends to be drawn to the things that we are conscious of, the objects, the contents of our mind, what's happening with our bodies, the external world, etc. And we forget a very obvious fact that we exist and that we are conscious. Now, does the light in this room require another means to be known? I mean, do I have to take a flashlight and shine it up at this light to be able to know and see the light? I don't, because the light is self-revealing. It's self-luminous. Light, being of the nature of illumination, doesn't need another source to illuminate. And it's the same way with you, with consciousness. Consciousness is conscious, and so it doesn't need another outside source to prove that it exists or to make it exist. Because sometimes people might say, well, if I'm not any of these things that are known, none of these objects, external objects, if I'm not the body, if I'm not the contents of the mind, then it seems like, then how do I know that I exist? I mean, how can you prove that I exist? Well, you exist because you exist. You exist because you're conscious. You're conscious because you exist. Both your existence and your consciousness are obvious. They don't need another consciousness to be shown, the same way that this light above me doesn't need another light to reveal that light. So your existence and consciousness is obvious, and that's how this part of the verse should be read. The self is obvious and self-evident. It is in and through the self that all men see, yet they don't see me. See just means they don't know, they don't recognize, they don't understand that they actually are the self. It's not that this verse isn't saying that, oh, why can't people see the self? Well, you can't see the self with your eyes because it's not an object. See here is a metaphor for knowledge. Okay, you can't see the self as an object because the objects themselves are seen, known by you, consciousness. So, the first part of the question, should I consider this statement literally? No. Sometimes when my mind is clear, I see things differently. Colors are more luminous. It seems that everything is flat like a screen in front of my eyes. I was thinking, is this screen the self? Well, if you can say, is this screen the self, then you're referring to something that you see. You're referring to something that is known. You're referring to a particular experience. So that classifies it as an object. So anything that is an object, you cannot be. So is this screen referring to this particular experience that he's having? Is this the self? Well, no, it isn't. The self is not that particular experience. So, should I keep inquiring into who is seeing this experience? Yes, absolutely. That's what we're trying to go for here. We're asking, hey, if you can say that this experience is here, how can you say that? How do you know this? Right? Are you the object that is known, or are you the knower of the object? And of course, we're saying you are the knower of this object. I can notice things as non-dual for some time, but the one noticing is still the person, the jiva. I have this doubt, what's happening? Is there something obvious that I'm not noticing? Atma Nirvritti seems to say that this has something to do with the perception, this experience that I'm having, but I know that perception is just a state of mind. Is there something obvious I'm not noticing? Yes, your own existence, your own consciousness. Atma Nirvritti seems to say that self-knowledge basically has something to do with this kind of perception that I'm having. Okay? But I know that perception is just a state of mind. That's correct. Anything that you perceive, perception itself, are known objects, and you cannot be those objects. The last part of it here, and this is an important one, says, I can notice things as non-dual for some moments. Okay? Self-knowledge does not change the perception or experience of the world. That's part of the doubt here that I'm seeing in this question, and it's a doubt that a lot of people have. It's almost like, well, if I can get my mind in a particular state to where I can see objects differently, in this case, he's saying objects seem to become flat. Objects the colors seem to be different, etc. There's many variations on these kind of things. People almost think that self-knowledge or enlightenment is when you suddenly perceive the objects differently, as somehow this difference is seeing them as non-dual. But that has absolutely nothing to do with enlightenment at all, because enlightenment is not perceiving the objects differently. Enlightenment is understanding what the objects are. Okay? It's the understanding that the objects are not actually real. It's the understanding that you are not the objects. You are not affected by the objects. In fact, all of the objects are affected by you insofar as they depend on you for your existence, for their existence, and you are always free of them. All right, so the commonly used example, is that the earth looks flat. Now, even though you have the understanding that the earth is actually round, even if you clear up any kind of doubts you might have, maybe you think, maybe the earth is flat. It looks that way, but you clear up any of your doubts about that, and you understand that the earth is round. Now, knowing that the earth is round, does it look round? No, it still looks flat. What about the sunrise? It looks like the sun is orbiting around the earth. It looks like it comes up in the east and sets in the west. But science will tell us that actually the earth is moving around the sun. But knowing that, it still looks like the sun moves. It still looks like the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So similarly, we're saying here that self-knowledge is about understanding. You can understand, for instance, that the earth is round and that the sun doesn't actually move, but the earth still looks flat and it still looks like the sun circles around the earth. But you have a clear, doubt-free understanding about how things really are, and you will not be fooled by the appearance again. And that's the exact same thing we're going for with self-knowledge, is the clear and doubt-free understanding with how things really are, despite the way that they look. The appearance of non-duality, the appearance of duality does not disappear at the advent of knowledge of non-duality. At the advent of self-knowledge, at the advent of enlightenment, at the advent of moksha or freedom, whatever you want to call it, the perception of objects remains the same. The experience of objects remains the same. So there's no point in trying to get your perception or experience to be different. If you happen to have an interesting spiritual experience, if your mind gets very clear and you feel good, those things are fine, but they aren't enlightenment, and you don't have to struggle to try to get those kind of experiences, because people who are enlightened don't see things any differently than people who are unenlightened. They're just not fooled by the appearance. They're not fooled into thinking that objects are real, that the world is real, that the body is real, that the mind is real. They know better. And because of that, it changes their relationship to objects. So we're going for knowledge only, understanding, not a change in perception or experience. And through that knowledge, it changes your relationship to objects, your relationship to experience. Because if the objects aren't real, then there's no reason to feel like you have to depend on them. There's no reason to compulsively chase them. There's no reason to compulsively try to avoid them. You don't have to be controlled by your desires for objects. You don't have to be controlled by your fears for objects. If the body is an object and it's not, and you are not the body, then you don't have to think that the limitations of the body belong to you. The size of the body, the shape of the body, the limited amount of power the body has, the limited amount of power that the mind has, the fact that the body is going to have pain and suffering, that the fact that the body is going to break down and die, you don't have to believe that anymore. That's what the understanding is for. There's still the appearance of the body. The body still experiences pleasure. The body still experiences pain. But you clearly understand that it isn't real. And because of that, you don't have to be concerned. And because the body and mind isn't real, you don't believe anymore that it affects you in any way. Right? The body looks the same way, smells the same way, sounds the same way, etc. Everything outside of the body looks the same way, smells the same way, tastes the same way. You eat food the way you always did. You get dressed the way that you always did. You sleep and go to work the exact same way that you always did. But your understanding is different. You know that those things are just an appearance, and you know that you're not associated or affected by those things at all. So we're not talking about perception in any way. Enlightenment is only understanding. It's only knowledge that you are the self. Non-dual consciousness, the eternal, unchanging, indivisible, infinite, imperceptible inner essence of everything, ever free of all action and experience. That is the knowledge. That is the understanding. That's what needs to be clear. and that in no way changes the way that the body or the mind perceives or experiences objects, but it does change your relationship to objects because you no longer need to depend on them for your well-being. You don't have to believe that there's anything in them that can ever make you complete, and you don't have to fear losing them because you are complete, because you're whole. So understanding changes, perception stays the same. I hope that this answers the question fully and completely. I just want to say that if anybody else has any questions, feel free to send them in. If you have questions about the ongoing Vedanta video series or my commentary on Tattva Bodh, I would be happy to answer them. Purnamidam Purnat Purnamadachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Bhaja Govindam Bhaja Govindam.